Hi, Joshua Parker here, and in this video I am going to review two really good books that I've read recently. One just came out last month. It's called Bottle of Lies by Katherine Eban. Great book. It's just amazingly well written. It really flows. It's like a spy novel about the pharmaceutical industry. China RX that came out last year. I am definitely not someone to be promoting pharmaceutical drugs. But I like to know what's going on, and that's why these books both sparked my interest. I'll start with China RX. It basically is a chronicle of how China and India now dominate the active pharmaceutical ingredients, what they call APIs, that are in all drugs made worldwide. 80% of all active pharmaceutical ingredients are now made in China and India. So what's the problem with this? Well, the problem is that these labs, they're dirty labs. They don't always necessarily look dirty, because they can sometimes look like the most state-of-the-art labs, but the problem is the oversight is lacking in these countries, and these companies take advantage of that. And the reason drugs often cost so much, don't get me wrong, I know some of the drugs are way overpriced anyway, even the brand name drugs. This book is more specifically about the generic drugs, whereas this is kind of more like a general overview of the industry on the whole. One of the reasons that drugs often cost a lot is because a lot of the batches they're not dosed quite accurately, or there's inconsistencies in the batches. In a normal oversight type of condition, those batches are tossed out. In certain countries where there's less oversight, those drugs are fine to sell on the market. The problem is when the data is manipulated and the FDA doesn't crack down on it, then these kind of drugs get into the regular drug market in the US, and this is a real problem. That's what's been going on in China and India. These drugs are coming in contaminated, and even if the pills are made in the US, these ingredients are combined into and pressed into a pill in the US. So most of this stuff is made in China and India. Heparin is an example. It's been known to be contaminated. There's been batches that have come in and been contaminated, and people have died over this. This is a blood thinner that's used by all diabetics during dialysis and a lot of other medical procedures. So it's a serious issue. It's one that we really need to address, because it's putting our drug supplies at risk, and these are drugs that are used in hospitals all the time. The heparin example is a really bad one, because heparin is actually made from the intestinal mucosal lining, I believe, in the intestines of pigs. And a Chinese company actually bought up the largest pig processing company in Pennsylvania just so they could dominate heparin. And now the supplies of heparin in the US are, we're basically relying on China for this. So if they don't want to ship it to us, then we're screwed. The hospitals are screwed. So in general, what they're doing is that they're testing, they're bringing in name brand drugs and pretending that these are actually the generics that they're putting on the market, and testing those and falsifying data. And they're also testing inconsistent batches and throwing out the bad test results and falsifying data to manipulate the statistics and thereby get their drugs approved in regions like the FDA in the US, where it's harder to get approvals. So they're essentially getting approvals for drugs that wouldn't normally match the criteria that the FDA requires, which is called GMP or CGMP standards, and they're manipulating the data to make it seem like they do. And in China, they've gotten great at cartel strategies of price manipulation to put competition out of business. They've done this with ascorbic acid, vitamin C, by just dropping their prices to the point where no one can compete. And then after all the other companies go out of business, then they ramp up the price and then they gouge everyone once they have the corner on the market. And they've done this with other drugs as well. But vitamin C is one of the examples. This book also has some information on how you can learn about where your drugs are being made, the ones that you might be taking right now. So it's a great book, China RX by Rosemary Gibson and Janardhan Prasad Singh, Exposing the Risks of America's Dependence on China for Medicine. That brings us to Bottle of Lies by Katherine Eban, which just came out last month. That would be May 2019. This is the inside story of the generic drug boom. Basically, what this is about is the fact that at this point, this is largely an expose of Ranbaxy, which was at one point the largest generic drug company in India. This exposes their data manipulation tactics that were used to get approval on a lot of essentially fraudulent pharmaceutical drugs and drugs that had inconsistent dosing. They were doing all kinds of data manipulation tactics to get their drugs approved in illicit manners, and they ended up getting a $500 million settlement with the FDA. During that time, before the settlement went down, they actually sold the majority shares to a German pharmaceutical company, but lied about the status of the FDA investigation that was ongoing at that time. So it's kind of like a spy novel in a way. The way one of the previous employees for Ranbaxy whistle blew on the company because he wanted to protect the citizens of the U.S. and other countries that were taking these drugs that were at best no good, at worst potentially deadly. This even led to the point where they actually got approval. They gained approval on a generic Lipitor, which is like the biggest generic drug they could possibly get. And this also documents how the generic drug industry was essentially created when this act passed, I believe it was in the late 80s, where the first to file company that managed to copy a drug that went off patent would get 6 months exclusive on that drug, and so they'd just be competing with the brand name drug. So there'd be one competitor. See, once all the companies roll into a competing market in generics, then the price drops like a tank and there's not much money to be made. But they would have 6 months, the first to file has 6 months as the only competitor. This is, of course, a huge gold mine for any generic company. But the thing is that these companies, they don't automatically get the methods of production from the original patent holder. Those methods of production are kept proprietary in most cases. So these companies in India and China, but this is about India, became masters at replicating or back engineering these molecules that they were then putting into production. But the thing is that they were actually falsifying a lot of the data, proving that they had replicated the molecule so they could get the first to file, even if they hadn't perfected the production yet. And that leads to all these problems, because then they're mass producing a drug they don't necessarily know how to produce, just because then they can sell it for 6 months and have an exclusive before everyone else rolls into the market. So they managed to get that first to file for Lipitor, and it was a big controversy because they had this ongoing FDA investigation for all this fraud, falsification of data, false testing, all kinds of problems in their factories, all kinds of things going on, and the FDA still granted that first to file and gave them approval on their generic Lipitor. I can go on, and I might ruin some of the suspense of this book. I still encourage you to read this book. It's a great book, but ultimately, even though they got the first to file, in 6 months they made $600 million on their generic version of Lipitor because of how popular a statin drug that is. And then some of those batches that were involved in those first 6 months of sales ended up being contaminated by metal particles, and a lot of it was even recalled. It's a crazy story. It's a really, really good read, and I encourage you to check it out. Bottle of Lies by Katherine Eban. If you found this video helpful and useful, go ahead and subscribe to my channel right here. Click on some of the other videos, check them out. Also, like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. Feel free to share on social media as well if you do that kind of thing. Thanks again for watching this video.